Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related ranting and raving by your, dare I say it, I was about to call myself your favourite resident specialist. Oof, oh, that just sounds egotistical. Oh, I don't know if I can say it. By me, ranting and raving about ancient warfare, where I can offer an answer to a question from a viewer, reader, or listener. And that's what I do here. I attempt to answer your questions. I've got a question coming up from Tom, or TomT5745, as their username is. You can, of course, ask us a question. You can send us a postcard or a letter. The address is Ancient Warfare Answers, P.O. Box 222, Belfield, NSW 2191, Australia. That will get to me. You can send us an email, awa@ancientwarfare.com, murray@caravansaraipublishers.com, editor@ancientwarfare.com. All those sorts of things. You can comment on a previous video or podcast in the comments section. I'll find that. Tragically, I do find myself, looking at most of the recent videos, looking for new comments. So even if it's 3 or 4 weeks old, if you comment on it, I'll find it. However you ask a question, it will get its way to me. Tom asks, sorry for this stupid question. There are no stupid questions, Tom, I will say. I have read a lot of the Red Loebs, excellent, but never understood how auxiliary forces were managed by Roman officers, or were they independent? Okay, Roman auxiliaries. Fascinating. Now, in terms of officer class for auxiliaries, the thing we need to remember, of course, is that the auxiliaries, as a sort of a unit within the Roman army, dates to the reforms of Augustus. And so prior to Augustus, you don't have the auxiliaries as such, you have allies. So if you think of Julius Caesar's Gallic or Numidian cavalry, they are allied troops, not auxiliary troops. But you then get auxiliaries under Augustus. Now, the interesting thing there is that you've got infantry cohorts and cavalry ala. Tacitus has a phrase once which says that the Roman army in the field had as many auxiliaries as legionaries. And that one mention in the annals, I think it is used across the board to calculate the strength of any Roman army as being equal number of auxiliaries to the number of legions that we're told. We get a little bit more in Josephus and a little bit more in Arrian's array against the Alans, especially Arrian names the auxiliaries and the legions. For the most part, however, in most battle accounts of the 1st and 2nd century that we have, we just get legions mentioned. When we come back to it with Ammianus, he gives us names of units, which could be a legion, Primarine, for instance, or Jovi, Herculani, or he mentions Batavians, Cornuti. So he's naming auxiliary units. He doesn't give us strengths or numbers. And, the strength of a legion in the Domitianic reforms is still a bit of a debate. Is it smaller or is it larger? I think it's smaller, but there are others who disagree. So you've got this idea of the Roman auxiliaries who initially are not second-class citizens. That's not quite right, but they are in a way because, of course, in the Roman Empire, you join the auxiliaries at the end of which you'll be rewarded with Roman citizenship. So it's generally for large groups of non-citizens. And as I said, the accounts give us legions, 4 legions, for instance, and so therefore we would say that there would be the equivalent of those 4 legions, so 20,000 men. There would be 20,000 legionary auxiliaries to make that up to double the 4 legions. And so we start going through all sorts of jumps. Some inscriptions can help us to tell us which auxiliaries are there. And so the auxiliary is paid less, 5/6, that's a very tricky thing to say, of a legionary salary. They're very often placed in the castella along the Roman borders. So later, of course, under the Dominate, you get the idea of Limitensis armies and Comitensis armies. The Limitani, who are the border armies, and the Comitensis, who are the field armies. Meanwhile, the legionaries themselves are stationed in the much larger castra, legionary camps that we know about. Having said that, there are several auxiliary units which are rewarded with citizenship whilst they serve, and they have a special epithet that they put on their inscriptions when they tell us that they're Roman citizens. But they remain auxiliaries. They don't just suddenly leave the auxiliary service and become legionaries. They stay as auxiliaries. So you've got that. Now, your question was specifically about the officers. Now, the fascinating thing about them is as the Roman principate advances, we find lots of auxiliary units being officered by noble aristocratic members of their own race. And that's fascinating. It leads to all sorts of problems in the Teutoburg Forest, for instance, in the Batavian Revolt. But they don't back away from it. So, for instance, the Arminius Revolt, the Varian disaster in AD 9, Arminius is, a Roman citizen. He's been trained under Roman armies. He's commanding Roman auxiliaries, and then he rebels. So I think his brother is a citizen as well. That lesson isn't learned because when we get to the Batavian Revolt in AD 69, you find several of the commanders, Julius Civilis, for instance. Julius tells us that he's a Roman citizen, that he's probably been made a citizen by Claudius. So that's like, oh, okay, so you've got Roman citizens of the race from whom the auxiliaries are drawn commanding that unit. And so that's really interesting. Going on epigraphically, the Batavians continue to be commanded by Batavians. They do, however, become commanded by others too. So it could be a Roman citizen of non-barbarian stock, and it could be a Roman citizen of the stock of that auxiliary unit. So what you've got, of course, is you've got a prefect of a cohort, which is between 480 and 500 men, or a mixed cohort, which is infantry and cavalry. You've, of course, got double units in some cases as well, Malarian cohorts. You've got a prefect of cavalry and a cavalry wing, or an ala, which is, again, between 400 and 500 cavalrymen. You've got a decurion, who's an officer commanding a turma, or a cavalry troop, which is generally 30 men. As far as I know, those aren't necessarily citizens. I think the commanding officers are, but the lesser ranks don't have to be. You've got a centurion, obviously, in the infantry, who commands 80 men. Again, a lot of the evidence comes from diplomas when they finish their enlistment, rather than during their enlistment. And so you've got citizens who lead them. You've got Roman citizens who lead these these auxiliary units, Batavian, Gallic, German cavalry from others. You've got specialized forces, so you find cohorts of archers, slingers. You've got these different ideas, but as I said, when we get to the Batavian Revolt, you've got three men involved in the Batavian Revolt. Gaius Julius Civilis, who's a Roman citizen, but he's a member of the Batavian royal family. You've got Julius Classicus, who's a leader in the revolt, who, again, the Julius tells us that he's a citizen. Julius Tutor, who's from the Trevi, or the Treveri, who is allied with the Batavians, but again, the Julius tells us that he's a citizen. So you've got all sorts of combinations there, because at the same time you've got a lot of the leaders of the revolting peoples who may supply auxiliaries, but when they revolt, it's not just the auxiliaries who revolt. So you've got Brino, for instance, in the Batavian Revolt, who's a Canafates chieftain. You've got Chario Valda, who is a leader of the Cherusci. Now, again, one of the interesting things in that is very often they're called kings, but there's no necessarily clear evidence that that's what they called themselves. It's almost as if the Romans, the only way for them to describe you is a rex. Sometimes they use dux. Certainly in later sources they'll talk about a dux of a tribe, but you've got the equivalency of, like, what do we call them? And so they'll call them rex. But then, for instance, when Julian is fighting the Alemanni in the 350s, there are 7 kings of the Alemanni. And so they join together for the Alemanni campaigns. And so chieftain would probably be our preferred term rather than king, but that's the way that Ammianus describes them, as 7 kings who join together. And then when you get to the Huns, you've got the 2 kings, the brother kings, and there are several other tribes who seem to have brother kings, which is peculiar because in a classical sense, we look at Sparta and we go, oh, those 2 kings are weird, but the Huns have 2 kings. I think several tribes of the Goths have brother kings, as do the Alemanni have brother kings. So that idea is not that unusual north of the Danube and the Rhine, just it's unusual south of the Danube and the Rhine. And of course, we're much more used to monarchies as opposed to diarchies. But then Attila, of course, rules alone when his brother Bleda dies, but they've got a term for that, which is the proton rhagon, the first king. But then, weirdly, when he dies, he divides his empire amongst his 3 sons, so they then have 3 kings. They then fall to fighting amongst themselves very quickly and essentially get rid of the whole Hunnic threat by infighting. But I digress. So I think that what you've got then is various different auxiliary units are commanded by Roman citizens, but they are also commanded by Roman citizens who might be from the race of that auxiliary unit. That has dangers, as in the Batavian revolt, the Illyrian revolt. You also find later, for instance, I'm thinking of this is late 4th century, in the lead up to the Battle of Adrianople, you have Barzimires, who is he's a tribune of the Scutari, which is a Germanic cavalry unit. Scutari from shields, using shields, but you're like, well, that's a very redundant etymology. But we get told that he's actually from the Cornuti. And at the same time, there is a unit of Cornuti. He's not the tribune of them. He's the tribune of another unit who seems to be a mixed unit of Germanic cavalry. So that's really, and of course by then they're all citizens as well. So it's complicated, but I think generally speaking, you are a citizen, but you are not necessarily a Italic or other Roman provinces citizen. You could be a citizen of the tribe from which the auxiliaries are drawn. And given the meritocracy of command, it's possible that you could choose someone from a different tribe to command a tribe. Under the wars of Marcus Aurelius, we get the breaking of the rule that the auxiliaries shouldn't serve in the region from which they were recruited. So, for instance, the Batavian cohorts are very often spend most of their military career in Britain, and they're then taken across to the east by Julian. So that idea of allowing Germanic auxiliaries to fight other Germanics is something that sort of leads to several disasters in Marcus Aurelius's wars, because they basically take out old grievances on other tribes who, they have a blood feud with, and you find the Roman auxiliaries destroying a particular tribe of Dacians that had wronged them in the past. But there you have it. So I hope that answers your question, at least in part, Tom. Keep reading the red Loebs. Try some green ones if you like. And, of course, you can join us again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.